I will tell you exactly what my brother said on the morning of his wedding. He was standing at the window of the east corridor at Thornwall, his back to me, a cup of tea going cold in his hand. The grounds below were gray with October mist. The estate looked, as it always did in autumn, like a painting of something magnificent and faintly sad. The long drive lined with elms already turning, the kitchen garden brown and harvested, the old south wall draped in the last of the ivy. He was watching it the way he watched everything, with a kind of remote authority, as though the world were a matter of administration. His butler Graves had offered some quiet pleasantry about the day. A fine morning, perhaps. Or perhaps that the household was ready, the arrangements complete, and everyone in good order. I don't recall the exact words. I recall my brother's answer. "This marriage means nothing to me," he said, not cruelly. That was the remarkable part. He said it the way another man might say the quarterly accounts had been filed, or that the south pasture had been let to the usual tenant at the usual rate. It was a statement of administrative fact. It is a solution. It will be treated as one. Graves received this without blinking. He had been my brother's butler for 16 years. He was immune to Elliot's delivery by now, if not always to his meaning. I was not immune. I set down my own cup and studied the back of my brother's head. Elliot Carver, 7th Duke of Thornwall, the most methodical man in 3 counties, and the most thoroughly convinced of his own self-sufficiency. And I thought, you have absolutely no idea what you are walking into. I was right, but it took me the better part of a year to be proven so. The young woman he was marrying was named Cecily Marsh. Her father, a man of modest estate in the northern counties, had died owing a sum to a creditor whose note my brother had purchased at a fraction of its value 2 winters prior, as part of a larger financial arrangement he had been rather pleased about at the time. The Marsh estate was forfeit. There was a house, a small one, and a daughter, 24, unmarried, described in the solicitor's letter as unremarkable in appearance, sensible in character, with no dowry to speak of. Elliot had read that letter across the breakfast table and said only, "A practical solution presents itself," and gone back to his correspondence. The practical solution was this. He would marry the daughter, settle the debt entirely, and allow her a home and a name and a modest security in exchange for her management of Thornwall's household, a position currently handled badly by a housekeeper who had been with the family 40 years, and whom Elliot could not bring himself to dismiss on grounds of both decency and sentiment. The marriage would be quiet, the arrangement clear, the expectations minimal. There would be no season, no presentation, no fuss. 2 people who did not know each other would occupy the same house and conduct themselves with mutual courtesy and leave each other otherwise alone. What there would also be, as I later learned he had already set in motion the very day he signed the license, was a provision. A legal document drawn up in careful language by his solicitor and placed in a sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of his desk. After 6 months, if both parties were in agreement, the marriage could be quietly dissolved. He had framed it in his own mind as a kindness to the woman. She would have had 6 months of security, a cleared debt, and her freedom. He would have had 6 months of improved household management and a problem resolved. A fair exchange, concluded cleanly, with no one the worse for it. He told no one about the provision. I found out later, as I found out most things about my brother, through the household, through Graves, through the slow accumulation of details that a large estate generates and that nothing and no one can entirely suppress. The wedding took place on a gray Tuesday at the parish church 4 miles from Thornwall. There were perhaps 12 people present. I was one of them. Cecily Marsh's only family was an elderly aunt who arrived in a hired conveyance and wept quietly throughout, producing a handkerchief at regular intervals with the dedication of a woman who had decided in advance to feel the moment fully and intended to follow through. Elliot's side of the church was composed of his solicitor, his land agent, 2 tenants he had obligated himself to invite, and me. I watched her walk up the aisle. She was not, as the solicitor's letter had suggested, remarkable. She was of middling height, with brown hair dressed plainly, and a face that was, the word I would use then, was composed. Not beautiful in the first glance way, not plain exactly, but composed in the way a well-made instrument is composed, all the parts doing their right work, nothing wasted. She held herself like a woman who had made a decision, and intended to see it through without flinching. She did not look at Elliot with hope or with fear or with resentment. She looked at him with a clear, direct attention, as though she were reading something and intended to understand it before she committed to an interpretation. He looked at her the way he looked at property surveys. The ceremony was brief. Elliot spoke his vows with the same measured diction he used to address his solicitor or his tenants on matters of legal particularity. Cecily spoke hers in a quiet, clear voice that did not waver, not once, not even on the last line when the elderly aunt made a sound that was something between a sob and a hiccup, and the vicar very slightly lost his place. When it was done, Elliot offered her his arm with a correctness that was impeccable and entirely without warmth, and they walked back down the aisle together. I fell into step behind them and thought about that voice of hers, clear and unwavering, a woman who had arrived at a decision and made her peace with it and intended to see it through. I liked her immediately, though I said nothing. With Elliot, the art of the thing is patience. The first weeks at Thornwall unfolded exactly as my brother had designed. Cecily was introduced to Mrs. Patton, the elderly housekeeper, with what Elliot described to me as a natural transfer of authority, gradual, respectful, so as not to distress the old woman. What this meant in practice was that Cecily spent 3 weeks learning, from Mrs. Patton, the entire working history of a house that had been organized by the same woman's methods since before Cecily was born. Every cupboard, every account, every supplier, every seasonal arrangement, and then quietly and without friction began introducing small changes that made those methods work considerably better. I know this because I stayed on at Thornwall for the first month on the pretext of estate business. The true reason was simple curiosity, and perhaps, I admit, a kind of concern that was not entirely detached. I watched Cecily move through my brother's house like water finding its level. She had a manner with the staff that was neither familiar nor cold. She kept a clear line of authority, but she was attentive in a way that Mrs. Patton, who had run the house with exhausted affection for decades, no longer had the energy to be. She learned the names of the entire staff in the first week. She remembered which of the footmen had a brother serving in the regiment and asked after him by name when she passed him on the stairs. She noticed, without comment, that the kitchen's flour stores were 3 weeks behind on restocking and quietly restocked them. She noticed that the morning room's east window was letting in a draft that no one had mentioned and arranged for it to be sealed before the cold fully arrived. She did not complain, not to Elliot, not to me, not to anyone I could discover. She did not seek praise. She addressed my brother when she addressed him at all with a precise and settled courtesy that gave absolutely nothing away, not warmth, not resentment, not longing, not indifference. Simply the clear attention of a competent person applying herself to the work at hand. He addressed her in return with the same. They shared a dining table at dinner each evening. The conversation at that table for the first 3 weeks was composed entirely of household matters, estate necessities, and on 2 occasions I was present for the weather. My brother had never been a man who required conversation. He was quite capable of sitting in silence with another person for an entire evening and considering the time well spent, and he extended this preference to dinner with his wife with perfect equanimity. She did not appear to mind, or if she minded, she did not perform minding, which amounted, for all practical purposes, to the same thing. On the 4th week, I was present at dinner when Cecily mentioned, with no particular emphasis and no leading tone, that the East Pasture's drainage had been causing the same recurring problem since the previous March, and that she had looked at the land agent's records and believed she understood the source of it. Elliot looked up from his plate. He regarded her for a moment with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that had surprised him, which was an expression he rarely allowed to appear, and then only briefly. "The land agent's records," he said. "I hope that was not overstepping," she said. "I was looking for the household accounts from last winter and I came across them in the same cabinet. The drainage problem is documented in 3 separate notes across 4 years. It seemed worth reading properly." "And," he said, "the culvert on the north side is too narrow," she said. "It was widened correctly in 1862 by your father's agent. There are records of the work. Then the records suggest it was accidentally narrowed again during a road repair 12 years later. The repair was documented under road maintenance, not drainage, which is why the connection was never made. The problem has recurred every year since." There was a silence. Elliot put down his fork. "You read the land records," he said. Not an accusation, not a compliment, something between recognition and recalibration. I read whatever is in front of me, she said, with the faintest suggestion of something, not quite a smile, not quite not. And then, with a composure that was entirely her own, she returned to her dinner. I watched my brother watch her. The property survey expression had shifted. I could not have told you what it had shifted to exactly, but it had shifted. He fixed the culvert. He said nothing about it to Cecily, nothing to me. He simply dispatched the land agent to the north pasture the following morning with specific instructions about the width. I told you he was methodical. He was also, when confronted with sufficient evidence, honest. I returned to London at the end of that month. I left with the distinct impression that something had shifted in the house. In some way I could not quite name, like a change in the air before weather, present but not yet legible. I came back to Thornwall in December for Christmas. The house was transformed. Not flamboyantly. Elliot would not have permitted flamboyance, and if he had permitted it, Cecily would not have chosen it, because it was not in her nature. But there was a warmth to the place, a scent of pine and beeswax, and something from the kitchen that was probably spiced something or other. A competent fire burning in the entrance hall, arrangements of winter greenery at the windows that were simple and well-placed. The corridors were clean and quiet and felt, for the first time in several years, like the corridors of a house that was properly inhabited. The staff moved through them with an ease I could not quite account for. Two of the younger housemaids were actually laughing together on the back stair when I arrived, a sound I was fairly certain I had not heard at Thornwall in my adult lifetime. They silenced themselves at my approach, but they had been laughing. Cecily met me in the entrance hall. She had a smudge of ink on her right wrist, which she noticed as she offered her hand, and which she regarded, briefly, with a mild and private exasperation before shaking mine anyway. "You look well," I said, meaning it. "I've been reorganizing the estate correspondence files," she said. "Several years of them. It's been somewhat involved." That was how I learned about the Bristol letters. It came out over the next 2 days, piece by piece, as these things always did in a house run by someone too competent and too self-effacing to draw deliberate attention to her own competence. Cecily had discovered, in the late autumn, that a significant portion of my brother's older correspondence with a firm of creditors in Bristol was in considerable disarray. Misfiled, some of it unread, and a series of letters dating back 4 years containing, buried in the usual commercial language, a clause that had direct bearing on a dispute Elliot's solicitor had been attempting to resolve for the better part of 2 years. A clause that, properly read and cited in context with 3 other letters in the same file, settled the dispute entirely in Elliot's favor. She had organized the letters. She had cross-referenced them across the years, identified the relevant sequence, and written a clear summary in her economical hand, 3 pages, annotated with the specific letter dates and file numbers, and left it on his desk one morning without remark or announcement. He had found it, read it, sent for his solicitor, and the solicitor had been, as he later described to me, rather astonished at the thoroughness. I found Elliot in the library the second evening of my visit. He was standing at the window again, which was his particular habit when he was thinking something he had not yet resolved into its final form. The grounds outside were white with the first proper snow of the year, and the light from the library behind him made the window into a mirror so that I could see both his reflection and, beyond it, the dark and silent park. "She found the Bristol letters," I said, coming to stand beside him. "She organized 3 years of correspondence in a fortnight," he said, "in what I understand was her spare time, while also managing the household, corresponding with the tenants about winter provisions, and resolving a dispute with the south field wall that the steward has been unable to settle for 6 months. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The solicitor believes the Bristol matter is now entirely resolved." "I know," he told me. "She said nothing about it," he said. "She simply left the summary on my desk and said nothing. I had to ask Graves how it came to be there." "That seems to be her way," I said. My brother turned from the window. There was something in his face I had not seen there in a very long time, not sentiment exactly, which was not an expression Elliot kept in ready supply, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has been carrying a precise survey of a piece of ground for years and has walked the ground itself and found the map was wrong in ways that matter considerably. "She didn't want the acknowledgement," he said, not a question, a careful observation turned over. "I don't believe she did," I said. "I don't believe she requires it." He turned back to the window. We stood in silence for a moment. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, soft and unhurried, and the park received it without comment. "She is not what the solicitor's letter described," he said at last. "No," I said, "she is not." I left him there and went to find a better fire. Christmas at Thornwall was quiet, as it always was under my brother's management. He did not alter his habits for the season. He rose at the same hour, worked at the same desk, walked the same grounds in the afternoon with the same stride. But I noticed that December that his afternoon walks occasionally took him past the small south-facing sitting room where Cecily spent her mornings with her correspondence and her account books, and that he sometimes paused at the doorway. Not long, a moment, the length of a breath, and then moved on. I noticed that she did not look up when he paused, or if she did, I never caught her at it. And I noticed that he never spoke during these pauses. He simply stood for the length of that breath and then continued on his way, as though he had been checking to confirm something whose existence he was still in the process of acknowledging. There was one evening in December that I have thought about since. We were in the drawing room after dinner, the three of us, a fire, the particular quiet of Thornwall in winter, and I had been reading while Elliot worked at his letters and Cecily sat with some mending at the far end of the table. One of the young footmen, a boy of 17, new to the house that autumn, brought in the tea service and managed to catch his sleeve on the edge of the tray. Everything stayed upright. It was the near disaster of a heartbeat, quickly recovered. But the boy went white with horror and looked at Cecily with the expression of a person awaiting execution. She looked at him calmly. "Steady," she said. "Set it down there." "All in one piece." She waited while he set the tray down with elaborate care, and then she said, quietly, "Well done," in a tone that was entirely matter-of-fact and not at all patronizing, and the boy's color returned and he left the room with something resembling his dignity restored. I glanced at my brother. He was looking at his letter, or appeared to be, but his pen was not moving. I said nothing. I went back to my book, but I noted it. I said nothing about any of this to either of them. Some things are best allowed to find their own level without interference, and Elliot in particular was a man who needed to arrive at his own conclusions by his own process, or he would dig in against them on principle. The more one pointed toward a thing, with my brother, the more thoroughly he would decline to look at it. One simply had to arrange conditions and wait. I returned to London in January. I carried with me the quiet certainty that whatever provision my brother had arranged with his solicitor, whatever clean and sensible dissolution, whatever administrative resolution, it was no longer as settled as he believed. Something had entered his survey of the situation that the survey did not account for, and he was, in the way of very methodical men, working out what to do about it. The letter reached me in February. 3 pages, which was extraordinary. My brother habitually composed his letters in the most compressed form he could manage, and 3 pages from him was the equivalent of a long and somewhat anguished confession from another man. He wrote about the estate, the Bristol matter fully resolved, a favorable outcome with the south wall, the east pasture operating correctly for the first time in 4 years. He wrote about a new arrangement with the grain supplier that had apparently saved a noticeable sum. He wrote about Christmas, briefly, in his characteristically compressed way. And then, in the last paragraph, set apart from the rest as though he had returned to it after writing the other 2.5 pages. The 6-month period concludes at the end of this month. I have not forwarded the papers to the solicitor. I find that I am not certain I intend to. I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I put on my coat, told my man to have the carriage brought round, and drove to Thornwall. I arrived in the late afternoon. The light was already failing, that thin pewter light of a February dusk, and the house was lit from within, the windows warm and settled looking against the gray. Thornwall in winter had always seemed to me a house braced against something, the cold, the isolation, the unrelenting quiet of it. That afternoon it seemed, for the first time, simply settled, simply itself. I came in through the side entrance, as I always did when I wanted to move through the house without immediate announcement, and I found Elliot in the corridor outside the library, standing very still. He was holding a sheaf of papers. I recognized the solicitor's seal on the topmost page, and the formal density of the language just visible at the top. A legal document, not a letter, not an account. The kind of document that says, in its measured and impersonal way, that arrangements may be concluded, and parties may be released, and everything can, if both sides agree, be folded away cleanly as though it had not occurred. He had not heard me come in. He was not reading. The pages were held loosely at his side, the reading clearly done some time ago by the look of him. He was simply standing in the corridor with the pages in his hand, and the firelight from the library visible through the open doorway ahead of him. And he had the look of a man who has finished thinking and is at the point of acting. He walked through the doorway. He crossed to the fireplace, which was burning low and steady, an evening fire with good coals at the base. He stood before it for a long moment, the papers extended above the grate. He did not release them immediately. He stood there in the firelight, this methodical, composed, profoundly private man, and I watched from the shadow of the corridor as he held the dissolution papers above the flames with the steadiness of someone completing an act already fully decided. He was not hesitating. He was giving it, I think, the weight it deserved. A thing you have been wrong about deserves to be acknowledged, even in private, even if only for a moment. The pages caught. He held them until they were ash. I stepped back into the shadow of the corridor and let him have the moment in private, because some things a man should be allowed to complete without a witness. Then I made considerably more noise with my boots on the stone floor and came around the corner as though I had only just arrived. He turned. He was composed as always, but there was something lighter about him, not a different person, nothing so dramatic as that, but the specific quality of lightness that follows a decision that was right. "You burned something," I said. He glanced at the empty grate, then at me. His expression held steady. "Old correspondence," he said. "Of course," I said. "Shall we have dinner?" "Cecily will be at the table," he said. "Yes," I said. "I rather hoped she would be." We sat at the table, the three of us, Elliot at the head, Cecily at his right, me across from her as I had sat in December and the winter before that at Christmas, and at a dozen dinners in between. The candles were lit and the fire was good and the room felt, as it consistently did now in a way it had not done before Cecily came to Thornwall, like a room that was properly used. I cannot tell you now exactly how the conversation moved that evening, only that at some point Cecily mentioned a letter from the estate's grain supplier who had quoted her a figure 2 shillings above what she had paid in October, with what she described as a confidence I found rather optimistic given that we both have documentation of the October rate, and only one of us appears to have consulted it. I laughed, and Elliot looked at her, and she met his gaze with that clear attention that was entirely her own, and something passed between them that was not administrative, and not the careful courtesy they had been practicing for 6 months, but something else, something that had been building in the corridors and the library doorways and the space between those pauses all winter long. After dinner, I excused myself. I heard from the corridor the sound of Elliot's chair moving and then his footsteps and the low, continued sound of 2 voices. I did not go back in. I found out later, through the workings of a household full of people who had watched the entire winter with rather more invested hope than they were strictly paid to carry, that Elliot had followed Cecily to the small sitting room, where she had gone after dinner to compose her reply to the grain supplier. That he had stood in the doorway, as he had stood in so many doorways all winter, but this time he had not moved on. He had said, she told me herself years later without embarrassment, because she was that sort of woman, "I owe you an apology." She had set down her pen, she had waited. "On the morning of our wedding," he said, "I told my butler this marriage meant nothing to me. I believed that to be an accurate assessment of the situation. I have come to understand that I was working from a significant insufficiency of information." She was quiet for a moment, reading the expression he was allowing her to read. "Insufficient information," she said. "Yes. And now," she said. He was not, by nature or by habit, a man given to speeches. He had never found them a reliable instrument. He said, with the care of a man measuring every word for structural soundness, "I have destroyed the dissolution papers. If you object to that, I will write to the solicitor in the morning and explain that I acted without consulting you, which is the truth, and we will proceed in whatever way you think right. If you do not object to it," he stopped. She waited. "I would like," he said, "to be married to you, in the way that marriage is supposed to mean something." Cecily Carver looked at her husband in the firelight of the small sitting room. This careful, proud, slow-to-arrive man who had finally, at the end of a long winter, looked up from his surveys and found the ground entirely different from the map. She said, "I think that would be acceptable." He reached out slowly and took her hand where it rested on the desk beside the half-written letter. He held it with a precision that was nothing like the administrative correctness with which he had offered her his arm in the church 6 months before. It was the careful grip of a man handling something he knows now to be valuable. She did not pull away. That, as near as I can reconstruct it, was the courtship of the 7th Duke of Thornwall. It was conducted over 6 months of autumn and winter, across a dining table and a land survey and 3 years of misfiled correspondence, in pauses in doorways and a culvert repaired without comment, and a grain supplier's optimistic invoice. It concluded by firelight in a sitting room, with 12 words and a held hand. I know what you are waiting for. Anyone who knew my brother will want to know, did he change? Did the composed, remote Duke of Thornwall become, in the end, a different man? The honest answer is no. He remained methodical, serious, and more comfortable with accounts and surveys than with declarations. He still rose at the same hour and walked the same grounds and addressed problems with the same efficient precision. He still found society occasions effortful and made no particular effort to conceal this fact, to the ongoing exasperation of every hostess in the county. But when I came to Thornwall the following autumn, the anniversary of the wedding as it happened, though Elliot would not have called it that. He would have called it October. I found him in the library with Cecily beside him at the wide desk. The estate map spread between them, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table near his. They were discussing the South Field drainage, which had apparently developed a new complication, and she was explaining something about the old survey records, and he was listening with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that mattered. He looked up when I came in, and he looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her on their wedding day, not the property survey look, not the administrative distance. He looked at her the way you look at something you have learned to see correctly, after a long period of seeing it wrong, with a kind of private, specific, entirely unperformed gratitude. She glanced up at me and smiled, a warm, quick smile, entirely unself-conscious, and said, "Your brother has been arguing that the Southfield problem is identical to the East Pasture problem of 2 years ago. I have been attempting to explain why it isn't." "She's right," Elliot said without hesitation. "He just conceded that," she added with mild satisfaction. "It took approximately 40 minutes," he said. "He is improving," she told me gravely. I sat down and asked about the Southfield and listened to the two of them work through it together. This serious, methodical man and this clear-eyed, unhurried woman, talking about drainage and culverts and survey records in the fading afternoon light of the Thornwall Library. And it was, for exactly what it was, entirely complete. He had told his butler this marriage meant nothing to him. He had said it with perfect conviction and zero information, in the way of men who have not yet been required to revise their surveys. The revision, when it came, was thorough. The papers burned on a February evening in the library fireplace. The marriage, the real one, the one that meant something, had been building quietly for months before he understood what it was. It had been built in culvert repairs and Bristol letters and a grain supplier's optimistic invoice, in a woman who did not ask for acknowledgement and did not perform her worth, and simply brought it, steady and clear, every day, until the man who had declared himself immune looked up from his accounts and found himself entirely rearranged. I was his witness at the wedding. I remain his witness now, and I expect I always will. I have watched a good many people fall in love in the years since. Some of them do it loudly, some of them do it at a single glance across a ballroom, some of them do it with declarations and roses and the whole astonished world watching. My brother did it by burning paperwork alone on a Tuesday in February by firelight when he thought no one was there. It was entirely consistent with his character. And it was, in the end, entirely enough.